Welcome, everyone, to the Conscious Health Podcast. I'm your host, TJ, and today I have my good friend, Larry Norris here. So, Larry Norris, go ahead and introduce yourself and what you do. And yeah, we'll give it that.
Yeah. Hey, TJ, thanks for inviting me today, and excited to be chatting about the benefits and potential risks of different psychedelic substances. Specifically, I mentioned the natural ones, but I guess we can talk about the synthetic ones too. I've been interested in this area for quite some time. I started studying neuroscience when I was an undergrad and had to do a lot of animal studies and that type of thing. And I was realizing at the same time as I was having my mushroom experiences, like, wow, okay, I'm learning all this stuff. This is in like the mid 90s, I'm learning all this stuff and it's not telling me anything about what I'm experiencing on mushroom journeys. It doesn't tell me anything about consciousness. It's just like consciousness is this mechanism, this machine in our mind, and everything's stored in our brain. And then I'm having these mushroom experiences where everything's much larger. So it kind of like started me on a little path that I am on today. After that, I did a bunch of travels all around the U.S. Actually went to MAPS when it was a small office in Charlotte, North Carolina. They gave me a bunch of different professors that were working on psychedelic research. But at the time, there's only really one person doing this research, Rick Strassman, DMT research in the 90s, and everyone else is kind of hiding the research behind other stuff. So I was kind of disappointed to see like all the professors I want to talk to about this were like, yeah, we're doing this research, but oh, by the way, we're doing it behind this other research we're doing. And so I was like, well, I don't really want to spend my time doing two different research projects at the same time. So I moved to Hawaii for about 11 years. I came across ayahuasca during that time, was really fascinated by that. And then started to do a little bit more research into where I could go to study this sort of really explicitly rather than hiding it behind something else. So I ended up going to the California Institute of Integral Studies, which is a transpersonal psychology school or psychology of spirituality school, if you will. That's in San Francisco. A lot of amazing people. Ralph Metzner is there, Stan Groff is there, Rick Tarnas, a bunch of other folks that have been doing this work. Started a nonprofit there called Entheogenic Research, Integration, and Education, which was working with showing people how to basically integrate their experiences and also bring different types of education to people. This started in about 2011. We had our first conference in 2012. You would think that in the Bay Area, this would be a hot topic, but at that time, it was only us and one other organization, the San Francisco Psychedelic Society, that was really making some waves, so to speak, in that time frame in a public sort of setting. So obviously, as you can imagine, a lot of people in the Bay Area were hungry for this conversation, and they all came out. We had some really, really amazing conversations. I like to really set up a panel or a conversation where there's two different people that don't necessarily agree with each other. And then you kind of see where the rubs are, and that sort of spot where they disagree is where the exciting stuff comes from. And so instead of just having it be a presentation where, it can kind of get drab and boring after a period of time, to have there being a little bit more of a discussion, a dialogue, somebody's like trying to prove their point to the other person to some degree. And then you can see some really sort of sweet conversations emerging from that. And then we also were doing a lot of work with integration work. So basically at this point in time, again, in 2011, imagine that integration was still kind of dismissed topic. A lot of people would say, oh, it's just people's egos talking. Why do we need to talk about our experiences, et cetera, et cetera? But we found that there's a lot of people who had these like mind-blowing, paradigm-shattering experiences of, spiritual nature, of personal growth, what have you. And they didn't really want to talk about it to their therapist because they were afraid their therapist was going to diagnose them or give them some sort of medication that would sort of reduce the experience and not really allow them to unpack the experience. So we said, hey, let's start doing these peer circles with a bunch of people who have had these experiences and share with each other. And we found that really, really amazing, people coming together, people sharing, talking about, the biggest thing with some of these big transformative experiences is the isolation that can occur from that, the alienation that can occur from that. So bringing people together, all of a sudden they're finding friends with each other, they're building community, all that kind of thing. So we're like, oh, this is great. This is working really well. During that time at California Institute of Integral Studies, I decided to go get my PhD. So I looked at ayahuasca archetypes of transformation, or sudden shifts that can happen, sort of these archetypal shifts, whether it be a death and rebirth experience, transpersonal ordeal, or somebody sort of goes beyond and they have this sort of, death and dismemberment type of experience in these other realms, or kundalini activation, or life history, past life experiences. What types of experiences are people having that can like shift their perspective immediately? What's interesting about this idea of these sudden short experiences is that, there's a sort of this theory called quantum change theory. Yeah, quantum as in like physics, but quantum as like sudden and disruptive and unexpected, right? And so in that quantum change theory, they found that the process of healing is slightly different. So, for example, when you have somebody that's a heavy drinker and maybe they want to stop drinking, when they have this sudden shift and you don't know when this can come from a spontaneous experience, this can come from an ayahuasca journey or any other kind of psychedelic journey or any other type of big transpersonal experiences where you have to like, you kind of stop and say, wow, this like shift that happens, right? That it turns out that that people don't actually have to change their behaviors anymore. They just become, for example, in this example, a non-drinker. So it's not like, okay, I'm drinking heavy, I had this experience, tomorrow I have to think really hard about not drinking anymore. It's just like, oh yeah, I'm not even interested, I'm not a drinker anymore. So this sudden shift that happens that changes the entire personality of the individual. That was what I was really fascinated about. And then in that process, like, how do we help people with meaning making or the integration or the implementation, which is the application of those insights into daily life. So I worked on that for a little while. Then around 2018, 2019, a group of us came together in Oakland, California, and we started chatting about, wouldn't it be great if we could actually start doing this, in person, and these sort of, consciousness type community events, that type of thing. And we said, well, how can we do that? Well, in order to be able to engage with people on these level, sort of psychedelic or entheogenic experiences, either you're doing it against the law or you're hiding or something like that. So we said, well, let's try and change the law. And so we started off in Oakland, California in 2019 to effectively decriminalize psychedelic plants and mushrooms. This would include mushrooms with psilocybin and psilocin, plant combinations similar to ayahuasca that have DMT, plants with ibogaine, and then cacti with mescaline. So there's 4 main categories we work with. We stuck with nature because, nature is not patentable. There's a lot less pharmaceutical influence there. And, while I could probably pretty easily teach somebody how to grow mushrooms. The idea of synthesizing psilocybin in your kitchen is probably beyond most of the people that are listening to this call and most people that I know. In fact, I only know maybe 5 people that even had a synthetic psilocybin experience, and hundreds of people that have had a mushroom experiences with psilocybin. So we focused on nature because it allowed a sort of a broader accessibility point. And then from there, we've been just kind of working on that since then. I think we're now about 30 cities. We just had our last city passed in December, our 30th city in Michigan, called Jackson, Michigan. And then I think the main areas, states we have are California, Washington, Michigan, and Massachusetts, with a couple spotting of passes here and there throughout. I think there's, if you include Colorado state decriminalization, about 10 million people currently live in the decriminalized area, which is pretty impressive. You hear from a lot of city council members, oh, it's going to be the end of the world, but we've had now this going on for almost 7 years, and it's going really, really well, I think. And a lot of people have been getting healing. A lot of people have been able to dive into personal and spiritual growth and things of that nature. I'm also working at Star King Ministry, which is a ministry school here nearby, and they actually have just started a psychedelic. I think they're the only Masters of Divinity that has a psychedelic track going now. So we're actually teaching ministers how to help people with their spiritual experiences that are coming from psychedelics and things like that. So I have about a 4-class schedule that I do, which is pretty impressive. Basically, advocacy and decriminalization is one of them. One is anthropology and psychedelic history. We're going to do one on integration, and then sort of the phenomenology of the inner experience, if you will. And then the last one is going to be kind of more transpersonal psychology, more sort of a broader range. But it's been quite a journey. It's been pretty amazing to see the development of this area of study since I started in 98, 97, 98. I'm sure for people that have been doing this for decades longer than myself must really be like, wow. I can imagine someone like a James Fadiman who was doing the research in the late 60s and then was told to shut everything down. As in the Nixon's Controlled Substances Act, then he's had to live now 30 plus years, 40 years, 50 years now, with this still being sort of oppressed, and now finally it's coming through again. So, in a way, we're a little bit spoiled coming to the front side of it, because I imagine being on the other side of it and then having this big sort of issue of legality come into play must be very difficult for them. So it's quite a journey, and really excited to see the continued growth of this work.
Oh yeah, I am too. Yeah, and and it's funny to put this into a perspective. I was born in '98.
Okay, great.
I've been born to a good time here to be a part of this. And just for the listeners too, for context, so me and Larry know each other through the organization Decriminalize Nature, where we help the decriminalization movement of psychedelics and entheogenic plants, which is something I want to touch on, especially at the end, on how people can help with that. First off too, I'm very impressed at your long history of education with this. So you'll be a fun mind to pick with this. So I'm sure, like, for example, let's take your first experience of mushrooms, if you can remember it. I'm sure that was a lot different than maybe your 20th time doing mushrooms.
Sure.
And so what are some basic things that you've learned through experience? Because I'm sure you've learned what not to do, but I'm sure on the flip side, you've also learned what to do better on how to not only have the experience when you take these substances, but you've also learned how to integrate them. So what are some tips you would have for people who maybe either they've done it once, and maybe they're just kind of scared, they weren't prepared for it, they're not sure they're gonna do it again, or people have never done it at all and they just don't know where to start?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's funny because my first experience, I had the great plan, to move forward and do this particular thing. And that's one thing I would say just right off the bat is like have a general plan, but probably not going to stick to it. Mushrooms are going to take
Yeah.
you in some other direction. I look
Yeah.
back now and I'm a little disappointed because my first, and maybe this makes sense because it would have been a pretty sort of raucous environment, so to speak, but also might have been great. I was actually living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, or going to school there or college, and I was going to have my first mushroom experience, and George Clinton and the Parliament Funkadelics were playing, and that's where we're going to go, which is like a very sort of psychedelic funk band, is from the sort of the 70s up until now. Even actually, I think they're still playing a little bit here and there, but
Wow.
very, very, very psychedelic band,
Yeah.
And so we were walking there, and the mushrooms started kicking in, and we found a playground. And we stayed on the playground for the rest of the night, just kind of
You
like
never
letting
made it to the
everything come in.
concert?
Never made it to the concert, so I didn't even get close. I think we were like probably like a mile or two away before, or maybe a mile away before we even, were getting close. So that would be the first thing I would say. Like, allow your sort of evening to flow how it's going to flow. Don't
Yeah.
don't get too sort of goal oriented because again, you just never know what's going to come up, especially if you're exploring these. I would say one thing that we didn't know back in the day that kind of is becoming more clear now is the idea of dosage. Mainly because when I was coming up, it was like bag is a dose.
Oh
Okay,
boy.
what does that mean? Is it a quarter? Is it an eighth? Is it a couple grams? I mean, an eighth is 3.5 grams. A quarter is 7 grams. A couple grams. So depending upon what type of mushrooms you have, 3.5 gram to a 7 gram journey is significantly different. But
Yeah.
3.5 is what would be considered, maybe to use sort of the modern kind of conversation by like Terence McKenna, would be under a heroic dose, and 7 is over a heroic dose by quite a
Yeah.
bit. So
Yeah.
so be careful on that. And then of course now, the mushrooms that are coming out are just like so much more potent. There's some, for example, some psilocybe azarescens that are growing, kind of pop up in this time of year in the Bay Area, and they're really, really, really potent. So what a half gram, maybe 2.5 little mushies, that's it. Like little guys like this big,
Oh wow.
and you eat them,
That's all you
and
need.
it was like a full on ayahuasca experience, super fractally,
Wow.
very colorful. But if I had 3.5 to 5 grams of that, I would have been blown out of the water. So there are some companies out there that are doing some testing. If you do come across any mushrooms, whether you're growing yourself or not, just the sort of the standard cliche statement, but it works really well, is go low and go slow.
Yeah.
There's no rush. The mushrooms will still be there. They've been around for 10,000, no, actually 50 million years. I think actually psilocybin first came around once upon a time. And the first cave paintings that they show that mushrooms and humans have been interacting, I think is around 9,000 BC. So that's almost 11,000 years ago. That's from Algeria in Africa. And so people have been doing this for a while. So they're not going anywhere, but learn your dosage, like take a little bit. Okay, this feels good. Or, hey, this is a little, okay, maybe I need to take a little bit more, whatever
Yeah.
else, but don't like just take the whole bag unless you're ready for a whole bag
Yeah.
journey, and then
Yeah.
if that's the case, make sure you're set up, get a comfortable space for yourself. Sometimes people like to be out and about, but when it hits hard, sometimes it's better just to be in a safe space where you can, drool on the floor if you need to, and
Yeah.
and make noises and not have everyone look at you, be like, what's that person doing,
Yeah.
because obviously when you start interacting with other people that aren't on the mushrooms, it can be a little bit confusing and sometimes
Yeah.
daunting and whatever else. So, get some water, get some music, have a nice comfortable space, maybe, put some little sort of electric candles so you don't have to worry about fire or anything. Just kind of nice lighting. Music makes a big difference as well. If you can have some really nice calming music. And then of course there's one thing that I know I've been taught many times in my ayahuasca experiences, which is basically like, sometimes the simplest lessons are the most profound. And those simple
Yeah.
lessons are, when it gets intense, breathe.
Yeah.
You're like, breathe.
Oh,
That's such an easy thing. How did I forget that? Right. But like, just like the, centering yourself and breathing, because sometimes these experiences are going to get big and intense, and you're like seeing things that you don't expect to see, and you're traveling, to what it feels like, breakneck speed through these sort of multiverses, if you will. Very,
yeah.
very similar to, was it Doctor Strange, that first movie with Doctor Strange? That whole scene where he's kind of like, where she touches his forehead and kind
Oh,
of like
yeah. And he's like
falls through,
floating
it's like all
back.
that
Yeah.
like psychedelic stuff. That supposedly a lot of that was helped to be made by a guy named Kalindi E, who was a sort of a mushroom enthusiast who passed away a few years ago out of Detroit, Michigan. And he talks about how they kind of contacted him to see like, hey, does this sound
Oh,
about
wow.
right? Or is this psychedelic enough or anything? So
That's
sometimes
cool.
you can get into
I know
these
that.
weird and unusual spaces. But not always, but it does happen, especially on the sort of higher doses and that type of thing. So those would be the things I would say, now I've done it enough times where even if I do have a big experience, you can always you can always respond to yourself by saying, it's only 6 hours
Yeah.
and I'll be back in 6 hours. Even if it feels like an infinite amount of time, or it feels like you broke yourself, or it feels like I'm never going to come back again, just relax, be calm, remind yourself it's going to be done soon enough, you know, close your eyes, get into it, or, open your eyes if it's too intense in that kind of realm. And I think those are also some really good things, because you don't want to be like, unless you really, 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 really need to, you don't want to be calling emergency services, because what are they going to do anyway?
Yeah.
They're going to put you in a hospital
Exactly.
room with fluorescent lights and the beeping noises and other people that are in pain and everything, and you kind of vibe off that. And it's a recipe for
Yeah.
a
It's probably
more
just send you
difficult
more
experience.
into a negative experience. Yeah.
Exactly. So I mean, and if you're still kind of new to this, you don't really know the terrain real well, having a sitter that's familiar with the experiences is always great. Or even someone that's just going to be like, hey, I'm going to be doing this journey. Just make sure I don't if I need anything, please give me a hand, and maybe get some water. Maybe need music
Yeah.
turned on. Maybe I need some support, or whatever else. But usually at that point in time, it's mostly an inward journey, so you don't really have to worry about that too much. So, but yeah, there's lots of different materials out there to kind of work with, and it's always amazing to me to think about these things grow out of the ground. Like how if we're kind of stuck in this like, oh, nothing's secret in the world, blah blah blah. It's like these things grow out of the ground and they have this experience that really takes us somewhere else. It's
Oh,
not like
yeah.
this experience is like, oh, hey, I was sitting on the couch for 3 hours watching TV.
Yeah.
That's what my inner journey was, or even when
Yeah.
people are like, oh, we need to do a VR. You don't need to do VR. Just close your eyes. You have a natural VR that happens, right? So,
Oh,
yeah,
definitely.
so it's always fascinating to me that's the potential of these different plants and mushrooms, and DMT is pretty ubiquitous in the environment. I think there's 80 or 90 different plants out there that have DMT, some insects that have DMT, sea sponges that have DMT, et cetera, et cetera. So we also probably have DMT in our body, in our system, which is why
Yeah.
we react to it. There's some speculation that at the time of our birth and the time of our death, we're flooded with this DMT. Again, that's all speculative, but an interesting theory all the same, because it brings us to the newer question, which is, what is consciousness?
Yeah.
And that's when we really get into the nitty gritty. Yeah, we can talk about mental health benefits. We can talk about all this other kind of stuff, the pretty lights and the colors. But at the end of it, it's like, what is consciousness?
Yeah.
Who are we? What is the nature of reality? And these types of questions, these more existential questions, can really come up and really surprise people.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Yeah. Something I do want to touch on too is set and setting. So those are two very big important things, because I've learned from experience that not planning out a set and setting, or just going into it, like you said, you should have guidelines as you go into a psychedelic trip. And some of those guidelines should include your mindset. So the mindset you have before you go into the experience, what are your intentions, and then also the physical place you're going to be in. Because I've had times like, so for example, the first time I did mushrooms, it turned out actually a really beautiful experience, and I really liked it. But I was, and this is back when I was 17. So it's like I still, a lot of friends. Actually, I don't think I knew anyone personally that had ever done them. So I had no personal reference to go to. And then all I had was Reddit posts I could read, and that was basically it. And even then, I don't remember even being able to read that much. So I was really cut off into how exactly I should prepare myself. This is back in 2016, I think. But anyway, so I decided I had these two friends that I kind of knew. I'd seen a couple times, and so I was hanging out in their car, and I put the mushrooms in a Chipotle burrito, and I ate them. But thankfully I had read enough to know dosing, so I only did, I think, a half an eighth. Thankfully I didn't do more than that,
Mhm.
because that was enough for skinny little me back then. So
Sure.
I ate that burrito, and I still remember when one of my friends, because I've been sitting there, and of course it takes about 45 minutes, at
Mhm.
least with a psilocybin to kick in. So I'm sitting there in a car, and I'm not really noticing anything. And then all of a sudden she plays this like EDM song, and just as it begins, her her dashboard in her car like does a little wave, and then she's like, "Is it hitting yet?" I'm like, "Oh yeah." And so thankfully it was, I had a lot of underlying anxiety. Well, back then I had a lot of underlying anxiety regardless, but I also had underlying anxiety with the fact that I was just in a car at a park. And I was with people that I kind of knew, but they weren't necessarily, I wouldn't say like they were my best or closest friends, or even probably even had the best intentions. So I was just kind of hanging out with them, and they've never done mushrooms. So they don't know what the
Mhm.
heck I'm going through. And so like at one point we were walking around the park, and then things just kind of had the eerie kind of vibe where I'm projecting my own anxiety onto, because of course nothing dangerous is actually there at that time. But as I was walking around though, my own anxiety I was projecting onto everything else. And so I was kind of looking around. I was like, I remember at one point there's like, I saw a guy walking a dog, but I think it was just like a stray dog walking around. So, but for me, I thought I saw a guy. So I
Mhm.
asked my friend, I'm like, "Hey, is that guy with the dog over there? Is he real?" And they're like, "The dog is." Like it was one of those. It was vice versa. Either I was seeing the dog or I was seeing the guy. But I saw him with that, and I remember at that point I was like, "I'm gonna go back in the car." And so they're
Right.
like, "What? Why? We're just walking around the park." And I like there was kids laughing, and I swear they're like laughing was turning evil. And anyway, I don't say this to scare people, but I do say it to underline the importance of the fact that because my anxiety and my insecurities were coming out, it's good to be in a safe place to be able to deal with that head on, instead of being in a public place, especially a public place you've never been, where there's people that they don't understand what you're going through. They don't realize that you're having a lot of your own negative emotions come up. And so it's very, because I've had other mushroom trips on the flip side where I'm at home. Like, for example, my most recent trip was with mescaline. I had a San Pedro smoothie,
Mhm.
and I drank that, and I had planned out well where I stayed at home. I just hung on my family. I had some negative emotions come up, some anxiety I had to face, and I had to deal with it head on. And I just breathed. I let it go through me. I was able to go to my backyard, be able to get sunshine, be outside, connect to nature. And then I came back in and spent a good part of the trip just listening to classical music with headphones and just lying in bed and just working on whatever emotions came up. And
Mhm.
so yeah, set and setting are very, yeah, they're just very important, because and I've had at least a few instances where my ego got the best of me, and I was like, whatever, I've done this a few times. I'll go to this house I've never been to, and I take them, and I'm like, and then I take too much, and then I'm seeing a lot of stuff, and nobody knows what's going on with me. And I've had those experiences, but I've had a lot of yeah, just amazing experiences too, though, with the right intention, with the right set and setting.
Yeah, I know. I mean, the set setting is so important. Is sort of we talked about, that sort of set being that inner space. So that's what you're speaking about, like this, so the projection you're making into the external world is kind of the set version, right? The
Yeah.
external world being the setting version. So even being outside, that's sometimes a great setting for folks.
Oh yeah.
But when there's other people around, we have this other thing. There's this researcher named Betty Eisner who came out in like the 90s, 80s, something like that. I think she wrote this paper,
Hmm.
and she added two set and settings. She added matrix, and matrix is the cultural or societal moment we're in. So for
Hmm.
your
Okay.
experience, being outside might have been great for the setting. The set would have been maybe your internal anxiety, but what does that internal anxiety draw from? It might have been from your own things, but also probably
Hmm.
a little bit is from criminalization, because you're
Oh
like, oh,
yeah,
okay, wait,
definitely.
I'm doing something wrong. This is against the law. I could go to jail. So that's another aspect of, with the nature stuff. And what we're doing is really trying to alleviate that part of it, because that really changes
Yeah.
everyone's setting immediately, because there's a little bit of fear involved there. And I always tell people right now, especially with this matrix thing, given the cultural context that we're dealing with right now, the matrix is not always the best. People are
Mhm.
dealing with a lot of stress going on sort of national, federal, and also worldwide, global level. So a lot of times
Yeah.
people will come from an integration experience and be like, I had these experiences and this doesn't even relate to me and I don't resonate with this at all, but somehow I kept getting these visions of blah, blah, blah. And then having them settle in and be like, okay, well, what's the scenario you're in? What's the cultural setting? What's the societal sort of framework that you're in? What's the
Yeah.
paradigm you're in? And then they're like, oh, okay. Then they can start to see and sort of piece apart what is mine and what is something
Mhm.
else, and
Yeah.
something else that you're sort of drawing upon. So that's something that's really important. There's also, you mentioned Reddit as a good source, sort of the classic source back in the day that I would use a lot would be something like Erowid. But there are these little sources out here that really kind of help you along with like, okay, this is people's trip reports, this is dosing amount, these are legalities in your area, those different types of things. It's always good to read up and get a little research on there. Keep in mind that you don't want to sort of influence your experience too much. Sometimes people will read things and then all of a sudden they have that experience, which is also
Mhm.
an
Yeah.
interesting side note of things, sort of the hyper
Yeah.
suggestibility of the experience,
Uh-huh.
right? So that's one thing that's really important. And then, in terms of setting, I would say, like making it comfortable beforehand. The intention thing is tricky because as you get into higher and higher doses, at some point in time, when you get to a high enough dose, your name becomes who am I? What is my name even? Where am I
Right.
at? So the intention is like
Yeah.
way out the door, right? You
Yeah.
don't even
Oh yeah.
remember what you're doing. So I have friends that'll actually like they said, okay, well, I'll put it into like a stone or a rock that I can hold on to. So if it gets really
Mhm.
intense, I can kind of hold on to it and that type of thing. But
Yeah.
like, yeah, because of the criminalization, you just basically have a scenario where being in your home is safe. Do not having to worry about the stigma that other people, laughing or feeling whatever. Even if that's not
Mhm.
happening out there, there's that sort of embedded framework that's in our head automatically that makes us wonder like, okay, what's going on here? So like
Right.
having a safe space to go, especially in your scenario where you had a space to go outside and sunshine, all that kind of thing as well, listen to some music as well. Finding music that's good. Sometimes there's a lot of underground practitioners around here who have sort of a framework for music. So it
Mhm.
starts off with something like maybe nature sounds, you're sort of moving into the experience half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour in, then an hour in, it's maybe more sort of, upbeat music, kind of getting you going a little bit. And then there's a period from like 2 to 3 hours where they call it chaos music. So it's like music that kind of like is a little bit jarring, a little bit throws you off, which sometimes is good if you want to
Mhm.
get into the sort of deeper layers of your experience,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then from there, there's more like celebratory music. So this is kind of very much like how a lot of jam bands will play. If you listen to Grateful Dead or Billy Strings or any of those folks, Fish or any of those kind of folks, they like will dive into this sort of roller coaster of emotions through their music where they'll take you
Mhm.
down in this deep space and then they bring you back up in celebration and then you
Uh-huh.
watch your internal emotional state kind of follow that. So that's
Oh
also
yeah.
really great. So I don't know how it is for the classical music you're listening to as well, but probably there's that sort of the ebb and flow, the ups and downs of that sort of musical sort of sound and sort of how you can, if you're like really observant enough, you can watch your internal space shift and change with the dynamics of the music as well. And so sometimes if you're having a difficult experience and you're listening to music, sometimes it's just as simple as like turning the music to something different and your whole
Yeah.
experience will change from being like really heavy and dark to being like, oh, light and celebration and that type of thing.
Oh,
So
definitely.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, something I found too with psychedelics. So, and I was talking to someone about this the other day because we were talking about mushrooms, and um, yeah, just someone I was talking to, and he basically said he had done mushrooms once, and he said I'll never do it again. And he wouldn't even open up about the experience. So my take on it is that because the thing would want people to know about psychedelics is the fact that when it becomes uncomfortable, especially if you take a high enough dose, it's not because the substance you're taking is just trying to hurt you or you're doomed or whatever, but it's the fact that these powerful plants, they bring up stuff that's already within you, and this is your opportunity to work on them, to let them go, because ultimately that's the biggest thing about every emotion for me that I've been shown. Every quote unquote negative experience I've had with psychedelics has always been an opportunity for me to let something go.
Mhm.
And the issue is if you're not ready to see what's within you, what you've been holding back and repressing, you're not ready to let it go, then you might have, let's say, like a half-ass psychedelic experience, or it just might not be as comfortable as maybe it could be. It might still be good, but your soul might have the underlying that negative, whatever it is that you feel. And so that's something I've seen a lot too, especially now that, especially psilocybin, now that it's become more popular. You can read about more studies about it, all the benefits, such as helping your lung cells and helping with PTSD and all this, which is all good. But I think one of the biggest things is that fact, though, is that these plants do bring up stuff. Because yeah, you might be able to take a low, medium dose, go to a party, not feel much, just have a good time, whatever. But for the most part, if you take a decent dose, especially like an eighth of shrooms, you're gonna have at least some part of the trip where you got to deal with something that's might not be comfortable for you. And then it's after, at least this is my experience, after you let that go, then yeah, the celebratory phase, like you talked about, where you're like, oh, like I was holding all that back, and I was repressing so much of my divine self, my soul, whatever you want to call it, my power, and then you, I don't know, the tears come out, you start feeling joyful, peaceful, all that. And so that's what I like about psychedelics. Another big benefit too that I've seen, so like we see, especially the studies coming out on psilocybin, like and they're all good things, they're all good benefits. There's like just a lot of those basic physical benefits of psychedelics. But for me, like I had bad dog allergies at one point. And so like it was so bad that, because I had them for years and years, and I realized later on it was started from a deep subconscious fear of dogs, actually, from when I was a kid. But I didn't realize that at the time. And so anyway, so I dealt with dog allergies. I just got used to it. Like I used to have to take Claritin every time I went to see my mother-in-law's what's called husky. And so it was very just frustrating. And like I'd have a stuffy nose all the time around dogs, but I really like dogs.
Itchy eyes.
It was, yeah. And so it was such an issue. And then it really became an issue once we lived with my mother-in-law. So we lived around a husky, and then we really wanted a dog. And so we got what's called a lab. And labs are like the worst dog to possibly get if you have allergies. Although I'm glad we got him, because then it provoked me. Like, and the allergies were so bad that we gave him back after a week. But it was so bad to where I couldn't leave the room. I had an air filter on. I didn't work at the time, so it was just like kind of whatever. It was just kind of depressing. And I was like, you know what? Like I'm like, and around this time I'm reading like Joe Dispenza, and I'm meditating every day. So I knew my body had a certain potential to heal. And then around this same time, I also want to try LSD. And so I happened to find someone that was selling LSD. And then when I had it, I just had the intentions, like, I'm gonna heal from these allergies, and whatever that looks like, I'm open to it. I just believe that the LSD can help my body to get into that state where it can start to relax and produce less what is that called? Histamine in the body, and causing distress and not be able to breathe. Because it got to the point where I almost had to be hospitalized just because I couldn't breathe. So I was using a nebulizer every morning and night, using an inhaler. I could barely walk. I couldn't walk up the stairs without being out of breath. And that's just no way for someone to live. So anyway, so I took the LSD a few weeks after we got rid of the dog. So it got a little better, but I took the LSD. And then I planned out the set and setting well. I basically just spent a lot of time meditating alone in a room by myself, and I was just ready to face the uncomfortableness of the allergy and why it was there. And I learned on the LSD, basically it was just brought to me like, oh, it's because of the subconscious fear you've had of dogs, and all these repressed memories I just kind of threw in the subconscious closet, so to speak. That all came up, and I faced it. I worked on letting it go. I didn't. It's hard to say what exactly happened. I was basically just meditating. I was having of course, all the cool visuals that you get with LSD. The walls were turning into all sorts of stuff. Like it was a really beautiful experience. And anyway, so I felt like that fear was lifted off me. And then I went to my wife and I said, because at this point I was comfortable enough, I could feel like I could go around places and beyond the LSD. That's not something I necessarily recommend to someone who's first going to do it. But I asked my wife, I said, hey, can you drive me to the pound? I want to go walk down every aisle of the pound and test this out, because I want to see if this is legit. And so sure enough, went down every aisle of the pound and my allergies were gone. And it was cool because as we're going through the pound though, I could feel like my heart like expanding. I could feel like the dogs like just negative emotions and their upsetness of just being locked up, which is understandable. And so it was kind of it was like a peaceful, reassuring thing. Kind of hard to feel all the dog's energy, but and then anyway, I spent the rest of the day just in a very peaceful, blissful state, just knowing that I let go of a fear that I didn't even know I'd forgotten I had. So,
Mhm.
and so
Yeah.
I think sometimes that's also an overlooked benefit of the fact that you can get past what is called your default mode network, the part of your brain that keeps your ego in place, this sense of self that it's set up as a defense to certain things, but also represses other things, maybe leading you to certain diseases or illnesses or whatnot. So that's another benefit too that I like to educate people on, that when you're ready for it, you can take these plants to the next level to do things that are quote unquote not curable or possible. So
Mhm. Yeah, I mean that's such a fascinating, conversation because as of right now, in order for that to be quote unquote proven or what the scientists will dismiss as anecdotal, it
yeah,
has to go through these FDA trials, right? Well, FDA
yeah,
trials cost $100 million. The only way you're going to have
oh
any
yeah,
input from that is if it's a treatment that is going to get them money back on the backside. So PTSD,
yeah,
for example, or treatment-resistant depression, or these different types of things. But things like OCD or things like allergies or things like that, they're not really talked about too much. But yet we have all
yeah,
these reports of people saying that, oh, this really helped. What's the mechanism? That's the interesting thing, and I think
yeah,
you spoke to the default mode network there. But really, at the end of the day, what we're talking about is the power of the mind. The power
yeah,
of the mind to be
yeah,
able to shift things, and we don't have the right scientific designs to study that right now. Because when we talk about the power of the mind, what is that called? It's called a
yeah,
placebo. And we
hmm,
dismiss
yeah,
that. We say, no, we're going to work the placebo out of this equation. Instead of saying, like, well, actually, what happens if these substances trigger the mind and the mind is strong enough to actually heal? As we see with these placebo studies over and over and over and over
yeah,
again, right?
oh yeah,
So I think that's really fascinating because there is this element of this hypersuggestible sort of state you can kind of be in. And if you can kind of say to yourself, hey, this is what I want to cure, however you're going about doing it. Some people, if you look at sort of indigenous traditions, they might say there's a, plant spirit that's helping, or there's sort of a different type of healing that's happening there, more of a spiritual healing. If you kind of go more the secular world, you might be able to say it's the power of the mind or the placebo or what have you. Consciousness healing, what's going on there. But I think that's really fascinating in terms of the potentials that we haven't even really
yeah,
started to
oh yeah,
explore. And that's why I was talking about consciousness earlier when we started this. Yeah, it's good for these mental health issues, but it's going to change the entire conversation around what is mental health.
yeah, oh
Because
yeah,
what is depression really? Oh, it's a disconnection from the self to the sacred, from the community, from all these other trauma that's happened in your life, et cetera, that causes us to sort of separate from this feeling of connection. And so, what do these materials do? They help us get that connection back. So it's not just
yeah,
as simple as like, oh, it cures depression or it
hmm,
helps heal depression. We can't say cure, right? That's the medical hates to say cure anything, right? But it helps to reduce depression or make it so it kind of goes away for a little bit of time. But at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is this reconnection. And what does it say when we can start talking about sacred or the spiritual in these medical contexts? What does it say when one of the treatments that they're using this for is end of life anxiety? So people that have terminal diagnoses for cancer or other different types of things that are worried about what happens after I die. And because
yeah,
of that worry, they're not living their life anymore. They're not connecting to their family. They're not doing all this type of thing. And then they have these experiences where they realize, like, well, okay, as Ralph Messner said, the most profound insight we can have as Westerners is the realization that the soul continues on after death. And
yeah,
so, if that's the kind of realization, whatever you want to believe, one way or the other, that's a whole nother conversation. But the fact that this is the experience that people have, that they realize like, oh, my soul, or they come to this sort of insight that my soul will continue on after death. This is just a portion of a larger life, our soul quest, if you will, instead of it just being
uh-huh,
like, this 100 years that we live on planet Earth, right?
yeah,
That shifts things in terms of like how we sort of engage. So what's happening there, and then in this medical context, we're actually talking about a spiritual issue. End of
hmm,
life anxiety is a spiritual issue. Oftentimes, it's like, what happens after I die? That's the
yeah,
question that's being asked, right? And it's not going to cure the terminal illness or any of that kind of thing, but it is curing or helping with the emotional distress that comes with the dying process. And
yeah,
death and dying is such a taboo thing in the Western world anyway. We're not allowed to talk about it. We're not allowed to, really share about it. It's sort of, not really, something that people want to jump into because it's depressing and all those other different types of things. But at the end of the day, that's the one thing we always have to do, right? We get born and we die. That's the only thing we know for sure. And the death is, if we believe in that DMT theory that I mentioned earlier, death is going to be the greatest trip of our lives. Right? So we might as well prepare for it. And actually, there's a guy, Bill Richards, who's out of I think he's out of Johns Hopkins. I don't forget which university he's out of, but he's basically saying, like, it's great that we're working with this for terminal patients, but we're all terminal. We're all no one's escaping death. So why do we have to wait until 3 months before they die before we give them experiences? Why don't we practice the process of death before dying well before? And so that's what you're tapping into, and other people are tapping into, and they're having these experiences. And and the research that I did for my dissertation, the death and rebirth experience was very powerful for people in terms of transformation. It was very much like it was a sort of passive, oh, I'm dying, I'm going through this fear, I'm going through it. Wait a second, it's okay. And then just getting over their fear of death was so profound, and I did do a longitudinal study to see kind of what the benefits were, over time. But those are good questions to be asking. Like, what is the benefit of not being afraid of death anymore? You live your life more fully. You're in the moment more instead of being worried about the thing that's happening in the future. So there's a lot of things that these different psychedelics and entheogens can do that are definitely beneficial. Other ones that you can think of, I've heard a lot of studies around cluster headaches, which are really, really painful headaches that people can have, and this can help with that. Obviously the PTSD, as we mentioned before. Treatment-resistant depression, end-of-life anxiety, OCD. I know there's some issues around smoking cessation, substance use issues. That's another one that comes up quite a bit, especially with some of the more the bigger experiences like the ibogaine. One thing for your audience out there, keep in mind, ibogaine is, you might hear people say, oh, it's cardiotoxic, et cetera, et cetera. It's actually just a little bit of risk factor if you have a QT elongation of the heart. It is a longer experience. It's about 30-hour trip or something like that, 24 to 30-hour trip, which is pretty, obviously that's going to be a big journey for you. So make sure you're doing it with somebody that knows what they're doing. But I had a friend of mine who had been addicted to heroin for about 20 some years. He started having dreams that he was not going to live through the end of the year. And, he's like, if you don't quit this, you're dead, and so he's like, okay, well, what am I going to do? Right. So he started doing some research, came across this thing called ibogaine, which is actually accidentally found that can be really helpful for helping people, especially with opioid addiction. Because what it does is it gives people about a 5 to 10 day window after the experience where there's no withdrawals or cravings. And for most people that are suffering from opioid addictions, the withdrawals and the cravings are the hardest part. Like, I want to quit, but it hurts too much. I want to quit, but I get so sick I can't even do it. Right? I have to keep on this, So, and methadone doesn't work because it's the same thing. You're just replacing it with something else. Or all these other different types of things that they're trying to replace it with haven't been really successful. So he was told, he went to go to the doctor. He was one of the first subjects in St. Kitts in the Caribbean area there, and they're doing these studies in the late 90s, early 2000s, and they're like, they're of course, any researcher's like, okay, well, how do I figure out grant money situation? So I don't want anyone to die, obviously. So they saw him. They saw that he was like, 20 plus years on heroin. He's like, you're too toxic. You're too, destroyed. We don't really feel comfortable bringing you into this. You might die. He's like, I might die. I'm going to die anyway. I'm going to die this year if I don't get on this. What do you mean? Let me at least make a choice. And I think that's some people forget about when it comes to risk assessment. For some people, let them take the risk assessment because they already know that they're on their way out in terms of what speaking of my friend here, he's like, I'm not going to make it through the end of the year. Here's my one chance, my one opportunity to survive. And what am I going to do? So then he had the experience, he talks about this sort of waking up the next 24 hours later or whatever, and sunrise coming up, and just a whole new life, and he doesn't feel like this sickness anymore. And then he's been 25 years now, I think, without any heroin. So it can be definitely very helpful for folks in terms of the benefits of it. And the interesting thing about it is it's most well known from a plant called iboga, which is a plant from Gabon in West Africa. But it's used in those traditions to do sort of initiatory rites of passage to see and view the ancestors. And so there's this accidental sort of discovery that can help with something like opiate addiction came across, and it's been really helpful to people in the West, especially as we have such a sort of, as I say, an opioid epidemic out here.
Yeah.
So it's been really helpful for folks to like sort of kick that habit if they need to. So little things like that. You have the mescaline cacti, those are often good for alcohol issues or depression as well. Ayahuasca has a whole range of things that can be beneficial for, although ayahuasca is a purgative, so you expect to be throwing up a little bit during the experience. People say, "Are these recreational?" It's like, not really, because something like ayahuasca, if you're okay being at a party throwing up or maybe shitting on yourself, that's one thing, but just kind of be aware ahead of time that's potential, because basically what that is the cleansing. And so this was also used as a cleansing to get rid of parasites in the jungle. But then they also found that this can be beneficial. Now, this is basically a combination of a DMT plant and a monoamine oxidase inhibitor vine that come together. Of course, there's all the stories around how did they figure this out in the jungle where there's tens of thousands of plants.
I was thinking about this just yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. So there's the Jeremy Narby theory, which is also probably true, which is basically they said, well, the plants told us to put these two together, right? Okay, I'm open to agreeing with that as well. But a more interesting and maybe more sort of grounded theory is this theory by Manuel Torres, who says that probably it was an exchange of information from two different cultures that were next to each other. So one was chewing the Banisteriopsis copy root as like sort of, because it does still have a little bit of a sedative effect, that type of thing. And someone else was using an Ananthanos peregrino, which is like a DMT snuff. You like blow into the nose, right? And so all of a sudden, I think these two people came together. Here, I'm chewing this. Here, try this. And all of a sudden, they've learned how to modulate DMT, right? So, how they found that in the jungle is really fascinating. But it's been going on for quite some time. So, really beautiful to see how you can have these ancient cultures which really know more about chemistry and botany and a variety of other things than we do in the Western understandings today.
Oh yeah. Well, speaking of ibogaine too, I know I have a friend whose wife was an alcoholic for a while, and I know that like after trying all sort like therapy, just like everything you think of here in America, and basically he just got to the point where he's like I don't care what you do. He's like we just gotta he's like I don't care what it is, we just gotta do something that's gonna end this. And then she went to Mexico, I believe, and then did ibogaine, and she's been free of alcohol since. So yeah, I've seen that do some wonders. We'll probably wrap this up here soon, but I was curious. I plan to actually do ayahuasca sometime next few years. Probably not anytime super soon, but I was curious, what are some benefits that you see from doing ayahuasca, like that you still hold on to today, or some lessons you learned?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of layers to it, of course. First of all, it's like the realization of, again, how big consciousness is. Yeah, that's like such a base level thing that you come across with, just like, wow, this trip was super big, or this journey was super, but like in that understanding is like, wow, I'm part of this sacred network, if you will. Right. And then there's like accountability that's happening. A lot of times, people talk about this sort of relational conversation that you're having with what we call a plant teacher or plant guide or plant spirit. What does that mean? Where's this wisdom coming from? That's not me, but it's helping me see things that I've never been able to see before, or perspectivizing things that I maybe had a really stuck point of view on. Again, that's through the default mode network. I was like, this is the way it is. And they're like, did you think about this? And you're like, oh yeah. Or like even seeing, like going back to memories of, relational issues and challenges that I've had in the past, and taking the viewpoint of the person that you thought was being the bad person at the time, right? And you realize, like, oh, wait a second, they have their whole life and the understandings of the world and how I was acting to them, and oh my gosh, So, I think it really helped me help with a lot of like sort of familial and friendship relationship issues, help me get a better understanding of things that I put in my body and how important it is to keep things. Of course, I still have sweets here and there. I kind of fell off that a little bit, but for a period of time, it's just a realization of like, wow, okay, like what are the things that we put in our body that can help us heal? How do we heal with our mind? How do we get centered? How do we stay focused? How do we help with our relational stuff? How do we not get so agitated when something in agitation comes in your way? Just realizing that there's so much, our ego creates a big mountain out of a molehill. We don't need to necessarily do all that. And so finding your center, realizing that there's a whole world of spirit teachers, if you want to call it that, right around us, helping us through all the time, every day, these different types of things that, again, are maybe a little woo for some people, but it's fascinating in terms of just shifting your perspective around
Yeah.
what it is that we're engaging with, how we're seeing the world, how we're seeing other people, finding respect for other people, even if we don't necessarily have that, giving them the benefit of the doubt for as long as we can. And then of course you got to stand your boundaries too sometimes, but those are the little things I think that really helped. And then of course, the purging process is, while it looks like from the outside is something that you're just sort of vomiting or whatever else, but really it's like something like almost like you're pulling in all that negative gunk in your body. You could think of like tar and like just nasty, kind of sludge that you have in your body that equates to traumas or challenges or feelings and emotions that you don't know how to deal with, or all things that we push down and oppress in our life, especially as males. You're not allowed to cry, you're not allowed to do this, we're going to push down. Well, here's this opportunity to take it, pull it into our belly, utilize this nauseous force to like move further and further and further into the journey, and then finally when the time comes to actually purge it out. Exactly. So that was pretty amazing. Definitely, if you do it, definitely recommend doing it with people that know what they're doing, that have, connections to songs. The healing songs called the Icaros or whatever are really helpful in terms of, taking you to spaces that can help with healing or finding ways or triggers to help you with purging and that type of thing. So, there's a lot of different sort of ritual and ceremonial aspects to ayahuasca that are different than maybe some of the other substances.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Good to hear. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. But I do want to briefly speak about the organization that we are with. Would you want to just real quickly give your thoughts of why decriminalization is important, why we're a part of this, or at least you can give your personal story, why you are a part of this effort. And then I'll go ahead and give my take on it as well.
Sure. Yeah, decriminalization I think is really important, obviously, because who has the authority to make these plants and mushrooms criminalized in the first place? That's ridiculous. Like you have a lot of people forget that, like I said earlier, 10,000 years people have been exploring these mushroom experiences. 50 years they've been criminalized. For some reason, we think these 50 years were the most important, and we can't go back to the 9,950 years before that, where it hasn't been criminalized, right? So, so what we really say is like, trying to stop people to get arrested. Legalization is a framework that can be built later on, but oftentimes if you don't do decriminalization before legalization, it becomes what people would call prohibition light. Well, if you have $10,000 to pay for a license, great, you're okay. But if you're just growing them in your backyard or picking them, you're a criminal still. Well, pay to play consciousness is not the way to go about doing these types of things. So we really want to say, let's start off with doing decriminalization. Let's start off with not arresting people, and then build everything on top of that as we move forward. That's fine. But it's been quite a journey. I think just the process of engaging with the city council. We don't do a voting process. We actually go to the city council and talk to them and try and get them on board. And in that process, you're destigmatizing this, across the board. You're helping educate people and everything as well. So that's really important. If any of your viewers or listeners out there want to help out, especially in Mesa, if you live in Mesa or other places, contact us at decriminalizenature.org. We do a monthly orientation. So on the last Wednesday of the month at 3 p.m. Pacific, we do sort of an hour and a half basically of like, here's what you do from start to finish. Here's the different phases of going on, et cetera, et cetera. Usually we average about 10 people per month. So, last year we probably trained about 120, 150 people in different cities all across the U.S. January 2026 is an exciting year, I guess, for folks. People are feeling it. We have over 20 people already registered for the end of this month. So it's almost twice as much as our normal average. So that's pretty great. And like I say, because I think people feel the importance of citywide politics versus sort of where you don't really have that much of a say in state or federal because the lobbyists are so strong there. You can actually make things happen on the city level, and it gets you engaged. At the end of the day, it's our job to protect consciousness. We wait for the sort of big time lobbyists or the pharmaceutical companies to do it. We're going to be cut out of the deal. So get activated now, and we can help you out with that. Find us at decriminalizenature.org or on our social medias at decriminalizenature.
Yeah, awesome, man. There'll be big things coming for Mesa, Arizona, hopefully soon, and then Phoenix.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, awesome, cool. Well, thanks for being on the Conscious Health podcast, Larry. Really appreciate all your comments.
Yeah, definitely. It was fun. Enjoyed it. Thanks, TJ.
Yeah, of course.